So today I'd like to speak to you about questions of provenance, shared heritage, and disputed archival claims. Throughout history, records have been displaced primarily through three causes. One is conflict, so we can think of the American invasions in the Middle East and their extraction of records to the US. Most recently, New York Times journalists removing records, the ISIS files from Iraq, or the great displacements across Europe during and following the Second World War. So conflict is one way in which archives can become displaced from the context of their creation. Another reason is decolonisation, and so I'll speak to you today a bit about records removed from across the Caribbean and Africa to the UK, but again there are many high-profile examples. One being the removal of records from Algeria to France, which has been a contentious issue for decades now. And then finally there is the succession of states. So that is when one state breaks apart or hands over administration to some other regime. So we may think of Yugoslavia there, where the kind of federal government creates records about the whole of the territory, and then when that territory kind of falls apart or breaks up into independent nations, then we have records that relate perhaps to a handful of countries, but because they are physical records, they must be held somewhere. So there can be dispute around the custody of those records. So traditionally, we have thought about archival displacement as related to these three principal causes. But increasingly, we are seeing literature, discussion about records that are carried into diaspora by refugees. What does it mean when we take our family records perhaps out of Bangladesh or out of the Middle East, and the countries that we once called home are no longer existing as a sovereign nation? What does that mean for archival displacement? So diaspora is one, and increasingly thinking about what it means when settler colonial countries take possession of indigenous records. So we may think of, in North America, the wampum belts, which to Western eyes might appear to be artifacts, but are in fact records. They are often treaties. They are taken and displayed in settler colonial institutions such as museums. So this is a broad kind of overview of this issue of displacement. This image is taken from an online exhibition that I have curated with my colleague from Zimbabwe, Forget Chatarera Zambuco. The exhibition is called Lost Unities, and it is available on the website of the Museum of British Colonialism. So this is a virtual museum, at least for now, and we have put together an exhibition that tries to surface and highlight the claims being made against the British government for the return of records. So at the end of the imperial project, this is in the 1960s, Britain was removing records from 37 of its former colonies across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. And since the 1960s, archivists in these countries have been asking the British to return these records. And the work of Mandy Banton sets out exactly how the British have responded to that, which has typically been to ignore these requests, to deny owning the records, and after 2011 to claim that they are in fact British records. So this is a colleague from Zambia asking in his mother tongue for the return of records to Zambia. This is one of our colleagues from Botswana. She teaches, these are archivists, and this colleague teaches on the archives course at the University of Botswana. Here she is asking for the return of records relating to the colony of Bechuanaland. And finally, another colleague from Zambia saying, we want to take care of the records about Zambia in the National Archives of Zambia. I would like to contextualize what I'm saying today about provenance by first talking about the history of multilateral efforts towards repatriation or resolution of displaced archives. And so we'll begin in the 1970s, 1977, when Charles Kecskemeti, the Hungarian historian and archivist who was formerly the Secretary General of the International Council on Archives. He worked with Everett Van Laar to prepare a document on behalf of UNESCO called Archival Claims, Preliminary Study on the Principles and Criteria to be applied in negotiations. Now, this was an important document because it sets out a number of professional principles that relate to the restitution of archives. Principles such as territorial provenance, which I will speak a bit about in a minute, and functional pertinence, the idea that when one administration hands over to another, the records about the administration of that territory should be transferred to the incoming government so that administration can continue. This is an old principle that has been observed in Europe for centuries, but has often not been extended to colonial contexts. So an important statement of principles in 1977. 1981, again, Kecskemeti develops model bilateral and multilateral agreements and conventions concerning the transfer of archives. So this was meant to be a set of documents that form a template for agreements between countries for the return of records. It is my impression that that document has not been widely used, but still an important kind of landmark in this history. Around the same time, the International Law Commission began work on what would become the Vienna Convention on the Succession of States. This was presented at the UNESCO Congress in 1983 in Vienna, and it called for the repatriation of records. And it was very strongly worded because the authors were primarily from the former colonial countries. So the drafting of this document was led by a well-known Algerian jurist. But because it was so strongly worded, a lot of the metropolitan countries refused to sign, and so this convention never came into effect, and today it is still not in effect. So for many years it has been considered a dead issue, but quite recently there are a new generation of archivists concerned with this topic who are now calling for a return to the Vienna Convention. 1995, the ICA prepares a reference dossier on archival claims. All of these ICA and UNESCO documents are available online. But this, again, an important document because it brings together various resolutions that have been made by international bodies on this topic. And then in 1998, the Austrian archivist Leopold Auer conducted an international survey for the ICA on behalf of UNESCO, and that's published as Disputed Archival Claims Analysis of an International Survey. So that kind of lends some colour to these kind of model agreements and statements of principle. In 2004, the ICA Congress was held in Vienna, so this is roughly 20 years after the failure of the Vienna Convention. And the Congress was held in Vienna, and so the National Archivist of Algeria took the opportunity to mark the occasion by bringing up the topic of displaced archives again. And that led very slowly, it took 5 years, but it led to the establishment of a working group on displaced archives. I was a member of that group, and we had two main objectives initially. One was to compile a bibliography on the topic, and the other was to repeat the survey that was conducted by Leopold Auer. But unfortunately, that working group didn't go anywhere. It met only once or twice. There was very limited communication, and so the whole thing kind of died out. And then in 2015, I was working at the University of Liverpool, and I started a research project on this topic because I saw that we were not getting anywhere with this working group, and I wanted to think about how we might start to approach the question perhaps from a more scholarly angle. A year later, the ICA established its expert group on shared archival heritage, and the chair of that group is with us today, Norge Sigurdsson. So that was established in 2016 and has representation from many different parts of the world. And to date, that expert group has kind of delivered on that vision of compiling a set of resources, a bibliography, and also of repeating the survey, which I'll speak about in a minute. 2017, the edited volume Displaced Archives is published, which was intended to try and kind of restart the discussion in the literature. A year later, so we see an acceleration now, there's kind of more and more work happening on this. The Association of Commonwealth Archivists and Records Managers. This organisation no longer exists, but it was an association of archivists from the former British colonial territories. They adopted unanimously a position paper calling for the return of the migrated archives, so of the archives from the 37 former colonies. In the same year, we launched an international survey which was meant to update the picture given to us in 1997 by Leopold Auer. And in the same year, the Forum of National Archivists met in Yaoundé in Cameroon and heard presentations from Norge and myself on this topic. And then 2019, the National Archivist of Suriname hosted a meeting of Caribbean archivists. And this was a really important meeting because for the first time we saw the question of displaced archives linked with the question of reparations for slavery and the extractions from the Caribbean by European powers. So the idea that the removal of records was, again, a grievance for which reparations were needed. Also in 2019 at the ICA conference in Adelaide, the Forum of National Archivists attended a workshop where Norge and I talked about the concept of shared archival heritage and questions of provenance, which I'll look at shortly. Before I get into that, I want to give you an overview of the results of this survey. I think we learnt a lot from doing this survey, and if we were doing it again, we would perhaps do it a little differently. But nevertheless, I think that the results are illuminating. So these are the responses that we received. So you'll see that there is a mix of countries making claims. Regarding this region, there is only claims 8 and 9, which were made by the Greenland National Museum and Archives against Denmark. Many of these relate to the Second World War and they're kind of European claims, or they relate to decolonisation. So most of the African and Caribbean claims are against the former colonisers. What's interesting about this set of results is that we see different actors getting involved this time. So in the 1997 survey, it is nation-state against nation-state. But in this survey, we see, for example, Claim 2, the autonomous region of Madeira, making a claim against their national government in Lisbon. We also see Claim 6, the archive of the Jewish community of Vienna. So we have not previously seen claims of this kind from community archives. And I think, yeah, probably the rest of them are kind of fairly straightforward. But I guess one other interesting example is that we're also seeing what I would call claims across the Global South, so one Global South country against another. But interestingly, those displacements do tend to be because records have been removed by withdrawing colonial powers and kind of left behind at various points. Yeah. What we see in the claims related to decolonisation is a pattern of racism that my colleague Riley Linnebaugh and I have termed the archival colour line. This makes reference to a concept articulated in the early 1900s by the Black American sociologist and scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that the colour line would be the problem of the 20th century. And by colour line, he meant, and I'm quoting here, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men. And we suggest that the archival colour line demarcates a large-scale and deeply historical racism through the dispossession of records. And what the claims against the European powers represent is an archival colour line that reflects in records the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men. So what we are trying to do here is point out that, okay, it is quite obvious that in decolonial claims, we know that it was the European powers who colonized, for example, Africa or parts of Asia. So we understand that there is a racial element to colonialism, but often that racial element is sublimated in the discussions about displacement. And we are trying to say that actually these conversations we're having about the restitution of records is embedded in this broader socio-political, geopolitical context that is characterized by historical racism. To understand disputed claims, we must understand provenance. And so now I'd like to turn to the question of provenance. So I don't know how this term is understood in this region, and I'm sure that you have your own archival traditions. I'm speaking about a kind of Anglo English-speaking tradition where we trace the concept of provenance to 1841, when the National Archives of France first declared that that would be the organising principle for the Archives of France. And in that understanding, there was a one-to-one, a very direct relationship between the ministry that created the records and the archive. And so that was the provenance. So the fond relates very directly just to one ministry. Okay, so it's a very kind of institutional framing for the concept of provenance. But since then, provenance has been expanded along these lines here, and I'll speak to you about the development of that concept over time. So we can start in 1966, when the Australian archivist Peter Scott published an article in the American Archivist Journal in which he outlined what is now known as the Australian series system. And this is a system of arrangement and description where the fond is no longer the highest level of organisation, but in fact individual series are described, and then individual creators are described, and then links are drawn, which allows for a concept of multiple provenance, which is to say, I mean, he was working in an environment where ministries changed, were amalgamated or broken apart quite frequently, and so he was trying to suggest that provenance was much more complicated than this one-to-one relationship that we had previously understood. And so by abolishing the fond and just describing at the series level, he was able to relate these provenential relationships more accurately. And so Jenny Bunn, who is at the UK National Archives now, is fond of saying that because of this, we can say that archivists actually conceptualized the semantic web as far back as the 1960s. I mentioned earlier that Charles Kexcometti had articulated the concept of territorial provenance in 1977. This is simply the idea that the place of the creation of the records forms part of the provenance. In 2005, again, the Australian archivist Chris Hurley describes parallel provenance, where there are multiple creators working simultaneously to create records. So it's really an elaboration of what Peter Scott was speaking about in the 1960s. And then this contribution, I think, was really important. This is Tom Nesmith, writing around the same time as Chris Hurley. Tom Nesmith was Canadian, right? There is, yep. And so he puts forward this idea of societal provenance, and he uses this record from the Northwest Company in Canada, and he says basically the author of the record, Steinbrook, and the company are part of the provenance, but in fact much of what is presented in the record draws on Aboriginal knowledge, and so surely the Aboriginal society that it documents forms part of the provenance, and so shouldn't that be surfaced in our description of the provenance of the record? So societal provenance. In 2016, Jarrett Drake suggests actually that the whole concept of provenance is very problematic. He writes, "The concept that the fonds of one creator should not be mixed with the fonds of another is, in theory and practice, a legacy of colonialism. Moreover, one can imagine the ease of determining a clear creator or owner when just a sliver of Western society had, 1, the legal privilege to create and own, and 2, the legal protection of that privilege." So he is not presenting an alternative form of arrangement and description, but simply saying that provenance stems from an intellectual mindset that was that came into the world at the same time as colonialism. And most recently, J.J. Gaddar has developed the concept of provenance in place, and this is from a forthcoming book chapter. But she says, "By provenance in place, I seek to make space for the articulation of an understanding of provenance that embraces the commitment to undo the colonial occupation of one's land by another today." And elaborating really on what Jarrett Drake said about potentially having to mix fonds, and by not doing so, we are universalizing precepts that were established at a time when the vast majority of people within and beyond Europe were not at the table. So you see then that over decades, the originally quite simple articulation of provenance has been expanded to encompass place, territories, societies, and multiple creators. There is a movement in the English-speaking archival world towards what is called liberatory memory work. So this is the idea first presented by the South African archivist Vern Harris, but developed by people like Michelle Caswell, Jamie Lee, and others. And if you're interested in reading more about this kind of critical turn in archival theory, there is an open source journal called the Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies, which many of these people are writing in. But liberatory memory work is archival and other kinds of memory work that seeks to overturn and redress oppression, so thinking about the way that queer, women, people of colour, indigenous people, disabled people have been oppressed by systems in general, but also including archival systems and record-keeping systems. How do we practice a memory work that is liberatory? And so part of this work is about what is called reparative or restorative redescription. So I think archivists all over the world probably recognize the limitations when it comes to description, that there are huge backlogs often of records that haven't been catalogued yet, and that description is often done perhaps more quickly than it should be, and perhaps not critically either. But reparative or restorative redescription calls for a slowing down of archival work, a more present and considered approach to description, including going back and correcting descriptions that perhaps use offensive language, like racist language and so on. So how do we make our archival descriptions fit for the present day? And so in the workshop that Norja and I presented to the Forum of National Archivists, we were basically taking this idea of redescription and trying to encourage people to think about how place and displacement does or does not appear in the descriptions in their own catalogues. So, I mean, when I look at some of the catalogue entries for displaced records, the kinds of records that I mentioned earlier in this presentation, often it is not very obvious from the description what societies, places, multiple creators actually participated in the creation of those records. That's kind of obscured by the description. And so can we start to surface place and displacement in descriptions? And does that help to move us towards a sense of shared archival heritage? And I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I wanted to end the presentation with 3 questions, which I don't have answers for, but I would love to hear your thoughts about this. Can archives displaced through conflict or decolonisation ever really be shared? Does redescription that expands provenance information help move towards a sense of sharedness? And once provenance is fully expressed, how can we start to address disputed archival claims? And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.